and thank you everybody for coming to my presentation this morning. I'm going to be talking about my senior thesis entitled Beyond the One, Sexual Orientation and Attitudes Towards Consensual Non-Monogamy. I became interested in this topic my third year, taking a close relationships course with Dr. Graham. So before I get into my study, I think it's important that we get some definitions out of the way. Now, according to the CDC and my study, monogamy is defined as when you agree to be sexually active with only one person, and that person agrees to be sexually active only with you. But in my study, I'm going to be talking a lot about three main types of consensual non-monogamy. The first is polyamory, and this is defined when one can love many people and maintain multiple intimate and sexual relationships. I'm also going to be talking about open relationships, which is an umbrella term, which means a couple agrees to independently pursue other relationships. And that could look like a multitude of different ways, emotional, sexual, whatever that may be. And I'm also going to be talking about swinging. And that's when committed couples consensually exchange partners solely for sexual purposes. So to give you some background research, in 2005, there was a study that looked at 48 countries with over 14,000 participants. And the research question was, how common is monogamy on an international level? What they basically found is that no country is completely monogamous or completely non-monogamous. So every culture lies somewhere in the middle of the continuum. And what they found on an individual basis is that those who identified as bisexual women and gay men were more likely to be non-monogamous. Now, there's definitely a halo effect when it comes to monogamy. And that basically means that people look at monogamy more positively compared to other different types of relationships. And in North America, as of 2014, 5% of adults engage in this consensual non-monogamy. And who is more likely to, personality-wise? Well, people that have higher levels of openness are more likely to be risk-takers, adventure seekers, and also those who identify as sexual minorities. So those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, anywhere on the spectrum. So you might be wondering who does what type of consensual non-monogamy. So for swinging, it mainly happens among heterosexual couples, and these couples are white, upper to middle class, educated, religiously affiliated, but not necessarily religiously active. And with open relationships and polyamory, there's a multitude of studies I've read about interviews done specifically with couples, and the interviewer always asks, why do you want to pursue this? Like, wouldn't it be easier to just be monogamous? And there's a common theme in their answers, and they're like, I want this sexual variety in my life, this sexual freedom, and so that was, one common answer among participants. And then also what they found is that people that identify as bisexual are a lot more likely to pursue this non-monogamy. So researchers wanted to find out why. And there's one hypothesis that there's these reinforced stereotypes with people who identify as bisexuals. So they have these stereotypes that people that are bisexual are more promiscuous and are less committed, and that then they internalize this and do in fact lean towards this non-monogamy. So my research question is sexual orientation associated with one's attitude towards consensual non-monogamous relationships, specifically looking at open relationships, swinging, and polyamory? Now, my hypothesis is that those who identify as bisexual will have the most positive attitude, while those who identify as heterosexual will have the least positive attitude. So let's check out my participants. I had 140 new college participants, and they range from 18 to 28 years old. There was majority female, but also a substantial number of male and non-binary participants. And surprisingly, there is 45.8% identified as bisexual or pansexual. Now, pansexual was grouped with the bisexual participants because it means being attracted to somebody regardless of gender. And then, so there's a close number of heterosexual participants, and compared to other studies, a substantial number of those who identified as gay, lesbian, or queer. And out of these participants, the majority were atheists, and 76% were in a relationship. Surprisingly, 31% of those in a relationship were already involved in a consensual, non-monogamous relationship. And when asked, would you ever consider consensual non-monogamy for yourself? The majority said yes. 61% said yes. So as for my materials, I had an online survey, which was administered on SurveyMonkey. And the first section of the survey had questions that asked about relationship, their history, and what they're more likely to do. They had an attitude scale, which I created because there wasn't an attitude scale that specifically assessed what I was trying to find. And then I got demographic information such as age, gender, and sexual orientation. So this is an example of the scale that I created. It's on a Likert scale from 1, very against, to 5, all for it. And it basically gives the definitions of the different types of relationships and assesses the attitudes participants have towards that. So let's look at my procedure. What I did is I invited participants via email on the forum. I got their electronic consent, gave them the online survey, and then debriefed them quickly online if they had any questions, gave them my contact info. So let's check out the results. These are the overall mean attitudes, and as you can see here, people are between indifferent and being okay with it, but let's look at specific attitudes. Now, I did achieve significance at the 0.014 level, and there's a significant difference between the bisexual and pansexual group and the heterosexual group. As you can see, the bisexual group has slightly more positive attitudes compared to the others in polyamory, but polyamory had the least attitudes overall. Not by very much, but still. And swinging, the ANOVA was approaching significance, and at the same time there was a significant difference between the bisexual and pansexual group and the heterosexual group. As you can see, all these attitudes are pretty similar between each type. The same holds true here. There was significance, and there was a significant difference between the heterosexual and bisexual group, but then again, it's 0.5. So overall, there wasn't very extreme attitude differences. So my hypothesis was supported. Those that identify as bisexual do have more positive attitudes towards consensual non-monogamy, as the research in the past suggests. However, there are certain limitations in my study. For one, the new college culture tends to be very liberal and accepting of these, alternative styles of romantic relationships. And as you can see, 31% of my participants already participated in this, so clearly a little biased. And my categories for sexual orientation, there were some participants that identified as asexual or demisexual, just different types of sexual orientation that I couldn't categorize in the 3 specifically that I was looking at. So in the future, I might do kind of like a drop-down instead of an open-ended for the sexual orientation. And also, the distribution for gender and sexual orientation wasn't exactly as evenly spread out as I would have liked. However, it was extremely good because I did get a high amount of participants that identified as bisexual or homosexual. And there are benefits of this study. For one, it contributes to the academic conversation surrounding close relationships and psychology in general, because there hasn't been a study at all looking at attitudes towards consensual non-monogamy with college students. So, I would also like to replicate this study in the future, specifically looking at the variable of age and attitudes, because I think there is a generational difference. I think it's more heavily stigmatized with older generations, so I'd like to see if that holds true in the future with more studies. And hopefully another benefit is that with more conversation about this subject, it could lessen the stigma surrounding consensual non-monogamy, because I believe everybody should make their own social scripts when it comes to love and romance. So I'd love to thank my advisor and sponsor, Dr. Graham, and my committee, Dr. Barden and Dr. Cottrell, my family, friends, and of course, Kay Saffe over here. Thank you so much for coming. Oh. You missed it, Don.
I'm sorry, that's a song in my life.
Thank you for coming. Yes.
Hey, question. Were you surprised at the results of the swinging part of the survey? Because the bisexual pansexual was so much greater than the national survey.
Yeah, I actually thought swinging in particular would be the most stigmatized. I thought I was going to be getting, horribly negative attitudes towards that. But it turns out, people were pretty okay with each type of consensual non-monogamy, which I was not expecting to find. I did do a pilot study, however, of my thesis my third year, and I did get similar results. So, yes, Dr.
There's a question about the labels for the points on the Likert scale.
Yes.
And maybe more generally a question about measuring attitudes of this kind. As it looks, some of the labels look like they're directed toward an attitude toward this kind of relationship for oneself, the not into it point, for example. And others look like they're more directed toward an attitude of judgment toward other people.
Yeah, I actually got this question from my back committee at my back, and I wish I would have gotten it earlier to change it before handing out the survey, but it is something I'd like to improve on if I do the study in the future, because I do think that the way I assessed attitudes was very general, and specifically in the future, I would ask, what is your attitude, specifically towards yourself participating in these types of relationships, and then what is your attitude towards others participating in this, because I think that's very different and that's an important differentiation to make when assessing attitudes. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
I noticed you have, not surprisingly from your college, a fairly significant, though small group of non-binary identifying people. How did you handle the intersection of non-binary gender with sexual orientation? That is, what does heterosexual mean for a non-binary person?
Well, you're right, I had 8 non-binary participants, and I didn't necessarily focus really on the gender variable. It was more for reporting the demographics in my study. I mainly focused my literature on sexual orientation as it regards 2 different types of relationships. So I really can't answer that question fully because I haven't done the sufficient research.
So to clarify, so the non-binary people still had to select that they were heterosexual or homosexual or pansexual?
Well, I had that question open-ended.
Okay.
So they could have described their sexual orientation however they'd like.
And where did those alternative descriptions get grouped? Or were they excluded?
Oh, I excluded participants with alternative sexual orientation categories because I didn't feel right, grouping them with the 4 that I particularly studied. 3, sorry. Yes, Sarah.
So how did you group in queer with lesbian and gay or homosexual? How did that work out for you? Because queer is more of an umbrella term for a lot of people.
Yeah, queer is definitely an umbrella term for other people, but I read literature talking about queer communities and the similarities with gay and lesbian communities, and I felt like I should group them together, and there was also a lot of participants who put like queer slash, lesbian or queer slash something, so I felt right in grouping them together. But I know the whole theory behind queer is kind of escaping definition and escaping this gay or lesbian label. So that could be something to consider for future research. Any other questions?
So in your program that you're going to
Yes.
In California, are you looking at doing this study that you said with an older group of people, maybe?
Well, the program I'm doing, I'm going to the University of San Diego for a master's program in counseling with a specialization in clinical mental health. So I would love to get into, relationship counseling and whatnot, but the program I'm doing doesn't necessarily require a thesis. Instead, it's a practicum project. So perhaps for PhD research, I would love to focus more on close relationships and see where that leads me. Because this is an open-ended field, and there's not a lot of research on consensual non-monogamy, so adding to it would be nice.
Are you thinking of a PhD down the line?
Yes, down the line, for sure. I'm going to grad school in the fall. This program's for 3 years. And then I'd like to gain work experience. And hopefully there's a program that is UCSD and San Diego State combined for a PhD in clinical psychology, and that's the goal. So thank you so much for being here and listening, everybody. I really appreciate it.